Chris Giles, Economics Editor of the Financial Times. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Anna Vignoles as part of the ESCoE conference on the Economic Measurement 2020. Anna is a Professor of Education at the University of Cambridge, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the topic of the moment, which is COVID and how its impact, particularly on the education sector. Anna, a lot of what we know that kids were off school from March until September. And a lot of the talk so far, and I think we've come back to this, has been on the impact of their education themselves. But give us a sense about the wider impact on the economy of children being off school.
Thanks. I mean, obviously the impact on children and families has been very visible. So children have been out of school, families have been highly disrupted, people have been trying to homeschool, and that bit's very visible. So I think people are aware that children have lost a lot of learning along the way since March. But I think what's less obvious is that from data from previous kind of experiences where children have been out of school for a long time, it's likely that those learning losses are not going to be easily won back, if you like. And so we're looking at permanent educational loss, and that then translates into loss of skill, of course. And if there's loss of skill and the kids are not coming out, or the students are not coming out of the system with the high levels of skills that we normally expect, they're going to then have a worse time in the labour market. And sometimes that's hard to imagine, because you think, why would a 7-year-old who misses 3 months of schooling still be experiencing it years later? But if we took, for example, the year 12s and year 13s this year, you can really see how they're never going to get an opportunity to get those 3 months back. They will be going into university or into the labour market really lacking some of the skills that the previous cohorts had. And that's going to impact on their labour market prospects, I think.
And can we quantify this? So kids they've lost a term and a half, or they've had a term and a half not in school. Some of them will have different experiences of home learning. What sort of scale are we talking about in terms of the long-term effects on their education, their skills, and ultimately the economy?
So as you say, the impact of schools being out, so to speak, I mean, they've been operational, but kids have been home, is being very different depending on the school, depending on the child, depending on the home environment. But if we take as a broad brush average that children have lost around 12 weeks of learning, and then we translate that into fractions of a year of schooling lost, and then we think about the economic value of a year of schooling, which is roughly 10% per year of schooling, we can think that, or we will think that, around about a 3% loss is a likely outcome from COVID shutdown from March to the summer. Now that's assuming that schools...
3% of what, just could you explain what the 3%?
Sure, sorry, 3% earnings. 3% loss of earnings forever, potentially. Basically because essentially children have lost a third of a year of schooling. Now the caveat to that, of course, is if when they get back into school, schools are able to mitigate that learning loss, then obviously we're not looking at such a big impact. But as you can see at the moment, schools are back, and it's hard going, and it's going to be very hard going this year. So certainly in the first year, we're not anticipating that they're going to be able to easily get that learning back. And for the cohorts who are leaving the school system, they've lost that and they definitely can't get it back. So we are looking at fairly significant loss of earnings over their lifetime.
And is this, if you take the sort of year 10, 11, 12, 13, the end of school, for kids at age 14 and above, if they move on to higher education, do we then think that their higher education might well mitigate the school learning loss? And so we're looking at kids who worry would be more kids who don't go to higher education, or is it a permanent effect that the school matters even if you go on to future education after that?
So that's a really good question. I mean, you're absolutely right to say that this is going to land differently for different children. We've seen this already. So children in more disadvantaged backgrounds have had a much greater hit from COVID because they're less likely to have received more support from their school, and they are unable to get the help from home as well. So different kids are going to come out of this differently. Now, for those going to higher education, yes, there's a possibility that they will essentially catch up. just as those who are very young in the system now, at least potentially, have the opportunity to catch up. It'll be those exiting straight into the labour market this year, or as you say, those perhaps going into further education that might struggle unless, again, further education is able to catch them up. It sounds as though all we have to do is make sure they catch up. The problem with that is if we think about educational inequalities before COVID, we had a very large gap in the achievement levels between poor and rich kids. And we haven't managed to close that gap substantially over a number of years. And so given that COVID has landed so heavily on lower income children and children from more disadvantaged homes, it strikes me that it's going to be very, very difficult to put in sufficient extra support to help that group catch up. Not impossible, and to be fair, the government has already announced a scheme to give them additional tuition. So it's not a project we should give up on, but I think people need to realise just how difficult it is to close the socioeconomic gap in a normal year, let alone try and mitigate the learning loss while we're still experiencing very acute dislocation from COVID.
Now, this is a conference about economic measurement. What do we know about what's happened so far, the kids' experiences? How have we been able to measure it in really real time? What do we know now for certain, or is this essentially a theoretical exercise?
So this is a really interesting case study in just how important it is to measure things. And so the first thing is we don't know what the learning loss is yet. We need to assess children on return to school. And I don't mean assess in the sense of having a high stakes, exam that sort of puts the schools under scrutiny for what they've done. I mean, just genuinely go out on a sample basis and find out how much loss of learning different groups of children have experienced.
Is this research happening?
Well, it's planned to. The Department for Education has suggested this is what they want to do. Our advice in the Royal Society report that Simon Burgess, myself, Rich Wilkinson and Ines Hassan were prime authors on, suggested that really what we need to do is measure a sample, not the entire school population, not least because of the challenges that schools are facing at the moment, but also to avoid this being an accountability issue. It should be a genuine fact-finding issue about how much learning has been lost and by different groups of children. But the other thing is, you focus on what you measure, right? And we think there's been substantial other impacts from COVID on school children. We know that schools are vital places for social contact, to develop peer-to-peer relations. They're vital places to pick up issues such as child abuse and other things. So we also want to be thinking about measuring children's well-being in a broad sense and other aspects of children's lives so that we can really understand what the cost of COVID has been. And not least also to highlight the fact that schools are far more than places of learning. They do a lot of other things for our children, as I'm sure every parent now realises.
Is this more at the primary level where the other aspects of schooling is important, or we know that there's a particular mental health challenge, particularly with girls in their teenage years? Is it both, and would you address that differently if you wanted to measure it?
Yes, so it is both, you're right. So in primary, obviously children are learning to interact with other children. You will not get your age 5 social interaction back again. It is very time specific, is it not? So for the cohorts that are coming and starting school, we're going to have to work to make sure that they get those experiences that they need to socialize with their peers. But a lot of psychologists are particularly concerned around adolescence. Adolescence is another period that's vital for building your sense of self, your social connections again. Lots of other aspects of your sort of non-cognitive development are really, really critical in those adolescent years. And as you say, it's also where we start to see mental health problems emerging. So we've got the double issue here. First of all, these teens have been, if you like, deprived of that social contact and may need to kind of experience more of it to catch up. But also some of them will have developed problems that because public services have also been either cut or gone online, may be missed. And we know that early diagnosis is terribly important for mental health. So that's another issue we should be worried about. And I guess that was my point about when we go back, or we are back, we need to think about measuring what we think is of concern. And that goes well beyond learning.
Now, the UK has traditionally always had very high stake exams, particularly at age 16 and 18. We know the debacle there was over the exam system this year. The concern now is for the current year 11s and year 13s. I'm speaking with a vested interest. I have children both in year 11 and in year 13. Is there any way of doing this fairly? We've talked a little bit about the averages, about average time lost, but we know that the distribution is going to be very different across society and across the country and across different school systems. How on earth can we as a society run a fair, high-stakes exam system in 2021?
So if I had the answer to that, I think I might need to be Secretary of State for the day. So a couple of points. I don't think we should make a judgment call about whether or not exams can proceed in the first week or two of term, but I think it's going to be really obvious that if we get to, say, first half term and the disruption has been extensive for individual children across all years, we have to start realistically thinking that this set of cohorts haven't just lost the months between March and the summer, but they're also having a highly disrupted 2020, 2021. And I mean, that would probably indicate that doing a high stakes exam at the end of it is a really bad idea. The other issue we have is after the summer's problems with the A-levels, there are some routes that we cannot go down. So although using teacher assessed grades led to what some have described as grade inflation, i.e. a higher proportion of the cohort getting top grades than the previous year, that was under the circumstances where teachers were under the impression, at least, that an algorithm would be applied and the grades adjusted. If we were, for example, to move entirely to teacher grades for summer 2021 with a clear indication that no algorithm would be applied, I suspect we might see even more grade inflation. It's not a criticism of the judgments, it's just unfortunately a fact of life. And that seems to be a very unsuitable way to award grades if we're going to use them in a high stakes way for entry to higher education. So I think the first thing we need to do is assess the disruption first half term and then start making decisions. And then after that, I suspect we're going to have to think about how it is that we perhaps compress the curriculum, but nonetheless have some sort of external benchmark or judgment so that the universities can still have data on which to base the places that they award next year. And it's going to be challenging, and we need to start that process very, very early rather than hoping for the best, I would say.
Well, that's certainly going to be a challenge for this year. So just when you look back at the COVID experience, what do you think the long-term consequences for both the people who've been at the sharp end, mostly the children, but also the rest of society is going to be? How will we remember this COVID experience for education?
So I think how we remember COVID will depend, as ever, on who we are. So I myself, obviously, am a privileged family. My children have privilege. We might remember it as a period where the children were home, they would be supported in their learning, the learning loss may not be too great. Hopefully they can go on and do well in the education system and then graduate. And then at the other end, you have people who have really struggled with, have 3 children in very small apartments and no IT, massive loss of learning. And now we're looking at a very disrupted 2020-21. So I think it's very important that we think about the inequalities of how COVID's being experienced. I also think when we look back in, say, 5 years' time, and I would say this because I'm an economist, we are going to be worrying about the economy. We're going to be worrying about the prospects for, well, my kids are slightly older than yours, my kids going into the labour market, your kids going into the labour market. The scarring effects we know are, they last a lifetime if you're unlucky enough to be a generation that tries to graduate into an extremely poor labour market. So I think how we remember COVID is still up for grabs, depending on how we respond, particularly on the economic side of things.
Well, Anna Vignoles, thank you very much for a really stimulating discussion about COVID and the education system. And unfortunately, with not the most optimistic outcome, but as you say, it does depend on how we manage it over the period ahead as well as what's already happened. Thank you very much.
Thank you.